In this last video, we're going to take a look at three remaining bones of the skull, our last remaining cranial bone. So if we tip it up, remember the occipital bone is all the way to the back, but I'd say the most interesting part of the occipital bone is underneath. So you actually have to remember the occipital bone is the entire back and underneath the floor of the skull. So the very large hole there is a foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is a bone that comes up through the it's right here also. In an articulated skeleton, you can see that it's basically the top of the spinal column. This is where your spinal cord comes up and connects with the brain. So this very large skull here, this very large hole here is a connecting point for the spinal cord to come up to the brain. On either side of the foramen magnum are the occipital condyles. Now this is the place where the skull basically rocks back and forth, and it allows you to nod your head yes and no. And it sits right on top of the spinal column. Here, it's going to sit right on top of a bone called C1, your top vertebral bone. It allows you to rock and nod your head yes or no. All right, so that is what we want you to know of the occipital bone. Next, we're going to take a look at the sphenoid bone. So for this, I want you to take a look in your lab book as well. It looks really different when you're looking in your lab book versus when you're looking at an intact skull. So when we test you in the lab, it's going to be looking quite different. This is the kind of bone that we're going to be testing you on. So the sphenoid bone is going to have a greater wing, which is, yep, and it actually comes up to the outside of the skull and makes up part of the cranium, a small part of the cranium. We also have a lesser wing. And the sella turcica, which means Turkish saddle, this is where the pituitary gland sits, which is technically not part of the brain, but it's kind of lower than the brain. All right, so that is the sphenoid bone, or the sphenoid bone. All right, the next bone we're going to take a look at in this video, the last one in this video, is this very odd bone called the ethmoid bone, which again is a strange little bone. It is internal. It has a lot of articulation points with the skull. It's considered one of the keystone bones of the face. And so this is what it looks like in your lab book, but this is what it actually looks like. If we look inside of the nose, you're going to see the perpendicular plate as a portion of your nasal septum, what divides your nose into left and right halves. The other way that we're going to see the ethmoid bone is we have to look up to the top of the skull. And this here is your cribriform plate. So the cribriform plate is just this small portion here. And it looks really different in your lab book versus in here. This is the cribriform plate, and in the cribriform plate we have olfactory foramina. Those little dots that you see there are olfactory foramina. These are the holes through which your olfactory nerves penetrate from your nose, from your nasal cavity, up through to a very anterior portion of your brain. And while we're here, we're going to do one more structure of the sphenoid bone. In the sphenoid bone, we have one more hole called the optic foramina. And what we do is you look to the back of the eye, and you're going to see two holes to the back of the eye. One is kind of more obvious and a big gap, and the other one is kind of smaller. So if you push go ahead and do that again for me. Can you see? Yeah, so you see that tiny little hole there. It is large enough for a pipe cleaner to go through. And this is where your optic nerve is going to leave your eyeball, and you can see that that's part of the sphenoid bone.